And I want you to go through those 7 steps in a second, Mark. Well, let me ask you guys just one last question. One of the things that I've observed about those who handle this F word really well is their ability to be able to separate emotion from the actual failure. Do you see that correlation?
Yeah, very much so. And with one additional fillip on it, and that is to also separate the person from the failure.
Yeah, exactly.
In other words, to depersonalize it in the way that Mark was suggesting earlier, where the question who, which oftentimes is the first question that an executive asks, who was responsible for this? Who do I need to fire? Who do I need to discipline? Who do I need to blame? That's the last question that you should be asking. Because the minute you put who in the first position, you're off on a bunny trail that may actually scare people from being honest with you about what actually happened and why. But it also suppresses people's innate willingness to say, hey, we got something that needs some attention here. We've got something that's gone wrong. You start blaming people as your first reaction, guess what? Nobody's going to be raising their hand saying, oh, by the way, here's a failure over here that we ought to be really dealing with.
Yeah, we like to say, can you go from blame and shame to learn and turn? And that's really one of the key differences that we look at between these organizations.
Mark, dive into the 7-step cycle. It starts, you shift from the F word to the R word, right? And it starts with respect. Go through that with us.
And each of these, with apologies to any pirates that are watching, starts with the letter R in our 7-stage failure value cycle. So the very first one is, do you respect failure? We shared with you a few of the areas, and in fact, we opened the book with statistics on failures across all sorts of disciplines, business, sports, etc. So we know failure happens a lot. And the question is, from an organizational standpoint, do you respect failure and understand that it can happen? And one of the things we look at here is we take a look at other disciplines. We look at science, which we've discussed, experimentation as opposed to projects, or engineering, which has an entire discipline in failure analysis. And they actually use failure to create better outcomes in experiments or stronger buildings and structures. So that's our first one, which is respect.
Yeah, the analogy that we use in this regard is that it's helpful, we think, to think of failure the way we think of gravity. It's an inevitable, pervasive fact of life. And just as it took us to respect gravity in order to learn how to fly, it takes a comparable respect for the power of failure in order to succeed as much as we'd like.
So our second stage is, do you rehearse for it? And we looked first at high resiliency organizations like hospitals and aircraft carriers. We talked to high reliability organizations to see they do rehearsals all the time. And then we flip it over and we say, what can high resiliency organizations do to also do a better job, even if they don't see the same kinds of failures coming at them again and again?
And an example of that would be every organization does fire drills, earthquake drills, maybe even anti-terrorist drills. But ask yourself, what's the most likely risks and failures that organizations are likely to encounter? It's going to be the ad campaign that bombs, the merger or acquisition that doesn't work out, the team that blows up, the product that doesn't work. And sometimes it's important to try to anticipate the far more likely kinds of failures that startups and other organizations are going to encounter. And ask yourself in advance, how are we going to deal with that? Do we have the resiliency built into our strategy? Do we have the early metrics in place to be able to anticipate those things and engage in building the muscle memory so that we can deal with it more appropriately, which takes us into the third stage.
Yeah, and there's a couple of interesting examples that we can cite too for number two. And then we do ask, when you think about rehearsing, that readers think about what's most important in their organizations, their crown jewels. So if you think about Target stores, for example, their customer data was hacked, 100 million records, and the CEO paid the ultimate price. If you look at NBC News, it's trust and credibility. And when Brian Williams spends a little extra time and adds a little bit more to the story, then you can see what the implications are for NBC News and for him personally. So we recognize that it's different for every organization. And then number three, if we move on, the third stage is recognize it. And that is, do you have in place those early warning systems looking out at the horizon to recognize failure earlier, to see its warning signs before it really has gone too far?
And there's an offensive dimension to that too, which is sort of the early opportunity alerts.
Yeah.
because most of the interesting events that happen, whether they translate into threats or opportunities, tend to fall in the perimeter, on the peripheral vision of an organization. And that means paying attention to a broader array of inputs, having a more diverse set of ideas and issues that your team is monitoring, and keeping an eye out on who's camping out on your perimeter that you might want to pay attention to sooner rather than later.
And that's why this whole philosophy of experimentation makes so much sense, because that's where you see it.
You know, you're probing
exactly
constantly on the frontiers and the outer edges of your business.
So we move on then to our fourth stage, which is react. So you've had a failure, you've recognized it. What do you do next? And the react it's a quick stage, but it's, do you react in a proper way? Do you apologize if necessary? Do you have your executive team out in front? Are you not blaming somebody, but rather owning up to it? And do you, buy the time that you may need, do you leverage the equity you have in your relationships with your customers and your stakeholders to be able to then more thoughtfully process the failure downstream?
And it's hard to find a better bookend examples of how to do it and how not to do it than how Lululemon dealt with its too sheer yoga pants on the one hand.
Yes, sir.
Versus how Reed Hastings dealt with it in the Quickster debacle at Netflix. Because in the one case, you had a kind of arrogant, I'm right, and I'll continue to say that. On the other, you had a genuine CEO's apology, which bought time, regained credibility, and allowed Netflix to retool itself, really redefine itself for a whole new generation of growth.
Yeah. Well, and in fact, what Netflix did, which was really interesting, is so they introduced Quickster. Their customers revolted. Their market cap, was down 75%, and people were basically writing the epitaph for Netflix as an independent company. But they bought that time with an apology. They said we made a mistake. And then they looked at the marketplace in our next step, which is the reflect stage. That's our fifth out of 7, and said, what's really going on? What's going on with cable? What's going on with content? What's going on with the way people consume that content now on their phones and mobile devices? And they really changed their strategy. Not only did they pull back the Quickster brand and made some more changes to their pricing, but they launched original programming like House of Cards and more that really helped move them into the forefront of an independent content producer. And then they executed that really effectively in the 6th stage, which is rebound. So once you've reacted and reflected, how do you put it to work? What's the execution on that?
And you want to do that sooner rather than later, but not too hasty if you haven't taken time to really do the kind of candid assessment that is in the previous stage of reflect. The rebound issue is really about, have you taken in the lessons that have just been presented to you? Have you been willing to reinterpret, reevaluate your strategies, your assumptions? And can you get back in the game with that kind of confident humility that we talked about earlier, recognizing that the very team that was involved in the failure that you've had is probably dealing with its own version of trauma.
Yeah,
and you need to anticipate that, legitimize it, and bring those folks back into the organization in a way that captures the value of what they've just gone through, but not stereotyping or stigmatizing them going forward.
Yeah, this is where we've moved from defense to offense, as you would expect as well in the marketplace.
And then finally, it takes us to a stage that we think is the flip side of the respect stage that we started off with. And that's the 7th stage of remember. Because we think too often organizations have an almost hit and run relationship with failure. They want to distance themselves from it so fast that they lose the opportunity to re-embed the experience that they've had and the example of resiliency that they've already demonstrated as a way of building the culture going forward. One of the organizations that we talk about in the book is a company called Henry Schein. It's one of the world's leaders of medical and dental products around the world. They, to this day, talk about an existential failure that they went through about 20 plus years ago that demonstrated the kind of grit and resourcefulness that the company was prepared to put into solving a major crisis. And the confidence that they've gotten out of that experience, the degree to which that informs the values of the culture that differentiate it in what has become a hugely successful worldwide organization is really quite striking.
Yeah.
And that's a good example of how leaders, if they're wise about failure, if they're savvy about failure, can actually use it to reignite this culture of resiliency and confidence going forward.
Yeah, that's a multi-billion-dollar company most of us haven't heard of. One of the things, I love WD-40. Most of us do, right? Mo, do you use WD-40?
Yes, sir. I'm not a handyman. I tried it this past weekend. In fact, then I had to ask my wife, do you just kind of like take the thing and just spray it on the garage door handle? She said,
I did
yes.
exactly the same thing on my front door. We were in sync.
So I actually did too. I had to beat something that was jammed up. So we all used WD-40 this weekend. Here's the amazing thing. You may know this story. WD-40 stands for the formula, water displacement formula number 40, that back in the 1950s, the Rocket Chemical Company was working on creating a lubricant that could also have all these other uses. Wouldn't it be great if you walked into the office of the Rocket Chemical Company and you saw cans of WD-1, WD-2, WD-3, because they went through 39 formulas before they got to 40. So they're one of those great examples of learning through failure.
Yeah, not to mention how great it would be to go to Coca-Cola and see a big bottle of new Coke.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a classic one. No, I know the story because I cheated when I read the book. You triggered something in me. I read something the other day about the most trusted leaders. And Mark Zuckerberg tops that list. And I'm just wondering from your perspective, is there a correlation? He's a terrific, obviously a brilliant guy, but a terrific leader. Is there a correlation between kind of that whole hackathon mentality that every day we're going to hack and do something different here at Facebook that kind of makes him so trusted with his team?
Well, not only is that, I think you're absolutely right, because there's a very gritty, let's just keep iterating till we get it right. But also, if you've noticed, Mark Zuckerberg has, just over the last few months, we've seen him talk more and more about the value of learning from your failures explicitly. And one of the things that's fascinating, whether it's with Zuckerberg or other leaders, is we found the people who were most willing to speak with us were those leaders that ultimately had been successful, because they have the confidence to look back and say, I made mistakes along the way, I learned from them, and therefore, as we talked about in that, I was successful. And then when we engaged with them, we asked them how and why. And that's really where this failure value cycle came from, as we were able to have those discussions. And I think you're absolutely right. Mark Zuckerberg's a great example of that.
And he's got a lovely balance too, because he says it's not about what you get wrong, which you will a lot. Yeah. It's about what you get right.
Yeah, and what you learn from that.
And moving on that as fast as you can. So it's not surprising to me that he gets the kind of respect that attitude deserves.
Yeah, it's astonishing. I think it's like 99.9%. I don't think I think there's some people in the 95, 96 percentile, but he's obviously the future. All right, a couple more questions because I know you got some important people waiting on you. But you in the book, you end with demonstrating to us the 3 rules of failure-savvy leadership. And it doesn't matter whether you're Mark Zuckerberg leading kind of the next generation business, or you're Jeffrey Imlet leading kind of the iconic General Electric. They apply to everybody. Will you guys demonstrate or go through that for us?
Mark, you want to start?
So, I'm sitting here saying the 3 rules of effective leadership. John?
Would you like to refresh your memory?
I'll tell you, the first one, the best failure to learn from is somebody else's failure.
But we have. Sorry, go ahead, Mo.
The best failure to learn from is somebody else's failure, right?
Absolutely.
And we can all take that one to heart.
Yeah, absolutely. The second best one is if you can simulate failure. If you can, in effect, try it on for size, not for real. And in effect, that's what we do in classes all the time with case method of teaching. The difficulty is that most of us learn from failure through personal, direct experience. Yeah. And the faster you acknowledge that, the more open you will be to both the pervasiveness, the inevitability, but ultimately the humanity associated with this other F word. We're all human beings. We're all going to screw up. We're all going to make mistakes. Teams are going to make mistakes. CEOs are going to make mistakes. We've got to be prepared to accept with some humility the fact that that's very likely to happen. Then we turn around and really put what we call failure-savvy leadership into action, which is can we learn from this? What is it that it's teaching us? Can we open our minds to it? Are we willing to change our strategy? If we think we're right, fine, let's keep going, but let's make sure that we're even more attuned to what the world is telling us in response to what we thought was going to work and is not quite working either as fast or as significantly as we thought it would.
And then ultimately, our highest objective is to get out there and just do. Right?
Absolutely.
We do, we learn, we refine. We do, we learn, we refine.
And you don't want to wallow in it. This is not about being so traumatized by it or afraid of it. Just get over it.
Right.
That's easy for you to say, man.
Well, you sort of, if you want to boil it down, it might be get over it and get on with it.
Yeah. And in fact, we start most of the time, and we do this when we address this topic here. Most of the time when you ask people to introduce themselves, they introduce themselves with their biggest accomplishments. There's a little chest puffing that goes on. In the book, as you know, we introduce ourselves with our unresume. Yeah, here are a few failures that we had along the way. And it's really through that lens that we start the journey, and it's kind of the way that we like to end the journey as well. Learn from your mistakes, share them, remember them so you don't make them again, and create a better culture.
But you guys do it in a way where, in all candor and seriousness, there isn't another book, another manual, another manifesto that does it in a manner that you guys do, where you can pick it up and in any chapter you can flip through and there's something useful. So I want to end with this. If you were going into a Facebook, a Google, an Uber, one of those amazing evolutions of businesses that are evolving in your neck of the woods, right at the beginning, right at the first 6 months or a year, and they have their small little founding team of 6, 10, 15 people, and you had an hour with them, what are you going to tell them?
You're more likely to be wrong than right. But recognizing that doesn't mean you're not onto something really great. The question is, how are we going to get to where we think we want to get as fast as possible with as little residual damage along the way? And fundamentally what that's going to mean is, how are we going to learn as fast as possible?
Yeah, that's where I would go. I would say that when you're at that 6-month stage, you're in the middle of a massive number of real-time experiments. And the way that you can best learn from those is to regularly share the outcomes, positive and negative, and have others share in them too, because they may have insights that you missed and vice versa. And it's by having those kinds of interactions that you're going to evolve more quickly, and you're going to redirect or direct yourself in that way to be most successful.
Yeah, and if we had time for another parallel message, I think I'd say, look, there are 3 of us in this room. We're starting the culture of a very big organization right now, personally. How we deal with this issue is going to have its imprint on a much larger organization that we hope to be creating. But don't kid yourself. Culture starts on day one. This is a key dimension of culture. It's a key aspect of the trust that we establish among ourselves as founders and with our first set of employees and their next set of employees. So we need to recognize the importance of this topic from day one. It'll pay off in many, many ways in the days and years ahead.
Yeah. And in fact, one of the things that we try and do, you mentioned what happens in startups, and we wrote this book to be relevant to startup entrepreneurs, to mid-sized business owners, and to people inside large global enterprises. And as you know, we have a chapter addressed to where failure exists and how it manifests itself in organizations of all sizes. And there are lessons that we can take from all of those.
Well, not all of us are fortunate enough to be sitting in the same room with you guys or taking a class. We get a glimpse of it through this book, but I have a feeling that this isn't going to be the beginning and the end of this topic. Where do you take it from here? What do we do as advocates of this F word to keep up with all the stuff you're doing?
Buy the book, number 1. Number 2, talk about it. Share it with friends. Start the conversation in your own organization. There is no one recipe. There is no one framework that in any way can insulate any of us from the inevitability of failure. That's why we like the force of gravity as one of the analogies. So be willing to engage it. Demonstrate through your own personal experience, through how you deal with it, that it's okay for you and your organization and the people who work with you to talk about it, to deal with it, and most importantly, to learn from it.
Yeah, I would have just a couple of things to add. Number one, it is about the words that you use. So think about the words of science or engineering as opposed to business. They're not nearly as charged with emotion in many instances as our business words are. It's about the stories you tell. It's about what happened, how did we survive, and what did we learn from it? And take a look at this executive. He was involved in that failure, and he's now the CEO of the company. Something like that that shows that you've created that culture that embraces failure or certainly survives failure with gusto.
And we'll be speaking in lots of different venues around the world in the months ahead about the book, about the topic, on social media, et cetera. So if you're interested in following how we in particular are doing this, you can check in the book. You'll see our coordinates, and we welcome your ideas, your reactions, and your suggestions.
Yeah, and if you go to the website of the book, it's theotherfwordbook.com. If you go to theotherfword.com, by the way, it's about faith. So there are other F words.
Well, hey, that's good. That's good to know. But hey, if anybody has to think about spending $20 to get the lessons in this book, I don't think they're the right audience. So I don't think we have to preach that. Gentlemen, thank you.
Let me give you one thing, though.
Please.
We have some free tools. If you're curious about it, take the test. You can download it for free from the website. Look at the failure value cycle. We have this available. We're open sourcing failure, if you will, just because we think it's such a valuable topic. And then, Mo, you have the last word, of course.
It's, you know, certainly there are a ton of free tools, but again, if you got to think about spending $20 to just to understand this philosophy, I think you got to consider whatever path that you're on. I hope that we can build on this dialogue. I enormously appreciate you guys taking the time to share what you've learned, and not only do I hope to be in your presence at some point, but everyone listening to have an opportunity to build on what you guys have started. Thank you.
Thank you so much.